Hey guys, tonight we continue where we left off in the previous video. For those of you who missed, this is the second part of a two-part video where we talked about one of the greatest minds in human history, Archimedes, a man whose genius bridged the worlds of pure mathematics and practical invention, whose machines could lift ships, defend cities, and whose insights laid the groundwork for modern science. So settle in, get comfortable, and allow the story to unfold at its own pace. And leave a comment letting us know where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always amusing to find out who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the light and maybe turn on the fan for a soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tale begins with an act of suspicion. King Hiero had ordered a golden crown to be fashioned as a votive offering to the gods. He provided the craftsman with a specific weight of pure gold and expected that same gold to return to him reshaped into a glittering symbol of devotion. When the crown was delivered, it was indeed beautiful, intricately worked, gleaming in the light, fit for a king. But rumors began to swirl. Had the craftsman cheated? Had he taken some of the gold and replaced it with cheaper silver? Hiero was no fool. He could not accuse without proof, yet he could not ignore the whispers either. The problem, however, was delicate. The crown could not be melted or broken apart without destroying its artistry. He needed an answer that preserved the crown but revealed the truth. And so he turned to the one man in Syracuse capable of solving such a riddle, Archimedes. The challenge was clear. The weight of the crown matched the gold provided. But weight alone proved nothing. Silver was lighter than gold, and if it had been secretly mixed in, the density of the crown would be different. But how could one measure density without destroying the object? Archimedes puzzled over the matter, carrying it with him through the streets and into his workshops. For days he found no solution. The problem gnawed at him. The answer was close, he could feel it, but hidden just beyond his grasp. Then one day, in the quiet privacy of the bathhouse, inspiration struck. As Archimedes lowered himself into a full tub of water, he noticed the liquid rise and spill over the edge. The more of his body he submerged, the more water overflowed. In that instant, clarity blazed through his mind. The displaced water represented the volume of his body. If one could measure how much water an object displaced, one could determine its volume. And with both weight and volume known, density could be calculated, revealing whether the crown was pure gold or adulterated with silver. The realization filled him with such excitement that, forgetting modesty, he leapt from the bath and ran through the streets naked, shouting, "Eureka! Eureka! I have found it! I have found it!" The people laughed, but the king listened. Archimedes had uncovered a method both ingenious and non-destructive. He would soon put it to the test, and in doing so, reveal not only the truth about the crown, but one of the fundamental principles of physics itself. Once inspiration struck, Archimedes wasted no time in turning his discovery into proof. The principle seemed clear enough. By comparing how much water was displaced by different objects of the same weight, one could determine their densities. But ideas, no matter how elegant, demanded demonstration. He began with pure metals. Taking equal weights of gold and silver, he immersed them separately in water-filled vessels. As he had expected, the silver displaced more water than the gold, because silver was less dense and therefore required more volume to equal the same weight. The principle worked. The challenge now was to apply it to the king's crown without damaging it. Accounts differ as to how precisely Archimedes conducted his test, but the essence is clear. He first measured the volume of pure gold by immersion, then compared it to the volume of the crown of equal weight. The difference was unmistakable. The crown displaced more water than the pure gold, meaning it occupied more space. Since its weight was the same, its density had to be lower. The conclusion was inescapable. The crown had been adulterated with silver. The fraud was exposed. The craftsman, who had thought his deception too subtle to be discovered, was undone by the simple act of water spilling from a tub. King Hiero, both satisfied and likely enraged, had his answer. Archimedes, meanwhile, had more than solved a royal puzzle. He had uncovered a universal truth. This principle, which we now call Archimedes' principle of buoyancy, states that any body immersed in a fluid experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. It explained why heavy ships of wood and bronze could float, why stones sank, and why even the human body felt lighter in water. What began as a search for dishonesty became a cornerstone of physics, a law that governs every object that touches liquid. For Archimedes, the discovery must have been deeply satisfying. It was not merely a clever trick, but a demonstration of how mathematics and observation could reveal the hidden laws of nature. The world was no longer governed by mysteries or chance. It could be measured, explained, and predicted. The story of the crown spread quickly. Citizens repeated the tale of their eccentric genius leaping naked from a bath, his mind aflame with revelation. Scholars marveled at the principle itself, while craftsmen and sailors began to see water not as an unpredictable force, but as something that obeyed rules. Whether the bathhouse moment occurred exactly as later writers described, no one could say. But the principle was real, and its implications vast. Archimedes had once again proven that his genius was not confined to scrolls or machines. It lived in the everyday world, ready to reveal itself in the overflow of a bath, the balance of a lever, or the turn of a screw. The image of Archimedes racing naked through the streets shouting, "Eureka!" became a story too good to forget. For the people of Syracuse, it perfectly captured the man they already knew, brilliant, eccentric, so consumed by discovery that he forgot all else. The story spread, retold at markets and in the court, until it became inseparable from his name. In Greek culture, sudden insight was often attributed to divine inspiration, the touch of the gods upon mortal minds. To the citizens, Archimedes' cry was not just a joke, but a sign that he was favored, a man whose thoughts tapped into truths beyond ordinary reach. Children would point at him in the streets, whispering the word Eureka as he passed. For the common people, it was proof that Archimedes saw the world differently, that where they saw water spilling, he saw a law of nature. The principle itself, buoyancy, had practical consequences almost immediately. Shipbuilders began to understand more clearly why some vessels floated and others capsized. Craftsmen and merchants could use the idea to test materials, to weigh and measure with new accuracy. Though Archimedes had uncovered it to solve a royal fraud, its usefulness spread far wider, influencing trade, navigation, and engineering across the Greek world. For Archimedes' reputation, the discovery was transformative. He was no longer simply a clever engineer who built pulleys and screws, nor just a mathematician who drew circles in the dust. He was a discoverer of laws, someone who revealed eternal principles hidden in ordinary experience. To the king, he was invaluable. To scholars, he was unparalleled. To ordinary citizens, he was something close to a magician. The word Eureka itself entered the language of discovery. Even centuries later, scholars, inventors, and explorers would repeat it to express the thrill of sudden understanding. The story of the crown proved that breakthroughs often came not in solemn halls, but in moments of everyday life, when the mind, restless and curious, finally caught hold of the answer it had been chasing. Archimedes himself may have smiled at the attention. He knew the crown was but one problem among many, its solution elegant, yet only a small glimpse of the order that governed the world. Still, he could not have failed to notice the way the story elevated his status. He was no longer merely Syracuse's mathematician. He was Archimedes of Eureka, the man who pulled truth from water. This reputation would carry forward, shaping how he was remembered long after his death. The principle of buoyancy would be studied, debated, and applied by engineers and philosophers for centuries, and the cry of Eureka, born in a bathhouse in Syracuse, would echo across millennia, becoming a symbol of human discovery itself. The crown affair left a lasting mark on Syracuse and on Archimedes' life. King Hiero II had received proof of his suspicions. The craftsman had betrayed him, substituting silver for some of the gold. Justice was carried out, though the details are lost to history. What endured was not the fate of the goldsmith, but the triumph of Archimedes. From that point onward, Archimedes' reputation was unshakable. He was no longer simply the clever young man who moved ships with pulleys or raised water with screws. He was the thinker who revealed hidden laws of nature, a man who could take whispers of doubt and transform them into mathematical certainty. Syracuse now looked to him not just for clever machines, but for wisdom in all matters of science. The principle of buoyancy quickly spread through the city's shipyards. Builders and sailors learned to trust Archimedes' insights, calculating displacements and ensuring vessels were designed with stability in mind. Farmers, too, benefited indirectly. If ships were safer and stronger, trade was steadier and food more plentiful. The discovery reminded everyone that knowledge was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. Archimedes himself did not linger long on the crown. To him, it was one solved problem among many. His restless mind leapt onward, exploring curves, spirals, and areas, calculating with painstaking precision. If Hiero brought him new tasks, he accepted them, but always returned to his beloved proofs, scratching diagrams in sand or carving figures into wax tablets. His colleagues and servants often found him so absorbed that he failed to notice meals, visitors, or even the shifting of the day into the night. Yet the crown affair had also made him something else, a celebrity of intellect. In a city where power was measured in soldiers and gold, Archimedes' power was measured in thought. Envoys from abroad heard of his genius, and his name began to travel beyond Syracuse. To the wider Greek world, he was becoming a symbol of the marriage between theory and practice, proof that mathematics was not an idle pursuit, but a force that could shape reality. The king, delighted with his mathematician, leaned on him more heavily. Syracuse's position between Rome and Carthage grew more precarious with each passing year, and Hiero understood that Archimedes' mind was as valuable to the city's defense as any wall or garrison. Machines of war, clever fortifications, and strategic devices, these would soon become the focus of Archimedes' work. The crown problem had begun as a tale of suspicion and fraud. It ended as the defining moment of discovery, a story that crystallized Archimedes' genius in the minds of his people. But greater challenges loomed. The Mediterranean was shifting, and Syracuse, caught between two empires, would soon face its greatest test. When war came, Archimedes would be called upon not as a scholar of geometry, but as the city's last best hope. By the late 3rd century BC, the Mediterranean was no longer a patchwork of small city-states. Two titans now loomed over the region, Rome in the north and Carthage in the west. Their struggle for supremacy, the Punic Wars, turned Sicily into a battleground, and at the center of it all lay Syracuse, wealthy, strategic, and vulnerable. Syracuse had long played a delicate game of survival. Under King Hiero II, the city had prospered through cautious diplomacy. Hiero had first allied with Carthage, but after the First Punic War, he wisely shifted allegiance to Rome, ensuring his city's safety. For decades, this balance held. Syracuse became a loyal Roman ally, supplying grain and ships, while Rome allowed it to retain autonomy. But when Hiero died in 215 BC, that balance began to unravel. His grandson, Hieronymus, took the throne, swayed by advisors who urged him to side with Carthage. The young king's reign was short and chaotic, ending with his assassination, but it threw Syracuse into turmoil. The city split between pro-Roman and pro-Carthaginian factions, each vying for power. For Rome, Syracuse's wavering loyalty was intolerable. The city controlled key harbors and could tip the balance of the Second Punic War. In 214 BC, the Roman general Marcus Claudius Marcellus marched on Sicily, determined to bring Syracuse firmly under Roman control. The stage was set for a siege that would last 2 years and test the ingenuity of both attackers and defenders. It was here that Archimedes, now an old man, but still intellectually vigorous, stepped into his most unlikely role, the defender of a city at war. Though he had always preferred the quiet of study to the clamor of battle, he recognized the danger. If Syracuse fell, its people would suffer slavery or death, and so he turned his mathematical genius to the grim business of war. Archimedes began designing machines for the city's defenses. Catapults of varying ranges lined the walls, calculated to strike enemies at distances from close assault to far approach. Cranes and grappling devices were prepared to counter naval attacks. Tales spread that he even designed devices to rain down stones or darts through hidden openings, surprising soldiers who dared to come near. For the citizens of Syracuse, his presence was a reassurance. The man who had moved ships and measured the heavens was now their shield. For the Romans, it was a growing nightmare. They had expected an easy conquest, but instead found themselves facing a city armed not just with walls and soldiers, but with the mind of Archimedes. Thus began one of the most remarkable sieges of antiquity. Syracuse, defended by geometry, standing against the might of Rome, and at its heart, the elderly mathematician, chalk-stained and absent-minded, yet crafting machines that would terrify even the most seasoned soldiers. When Marcellus's Roman legions approached Syracuse in 214 BC, they expected a swift victory. Syracuse was wealthy but small, and Rome had faced and conquered far greater foes. Yet they had not reckoned with Archimedes. From the walls of the city, his catapults waited. Unlike the crude engines of other cities, these were machines of terrifying precision, crafted from wood and rope and iron, but guided by the exactness of geometry. Archimedes had designed catapults of different sizes, calibrated to strike at varying ranges. As the Romans advanced, they suddenly found themselves under attack from a rain of missiles hurled with uncanny accuracy. At a distance, heavy stones crashed down upon the legions, shattering shields and scattering formations. As they drew nearer, smaller catapults unleashed volleys of darts and javelins, piercing armor and driving men back in confusion. There seemed no safe distance, no way to approach without being struck by the relentless machines. The Romans were astonished. Accounts from ancient writers described their frustration as siege towers and battering rams were smashed apart before they could even reach the walls. Ships that dared to come close to the harbor were struck by stones so large that timber splintered and decks collapsed. The soldiers began to believe they were fighting not against men, but against gods. The psychological effect was as powerful as the physical damage. Roman morale faltered, while the citizens of Syracuse cheered from the walls, emboldened by the sight of their enemies retreating under the onslaught. Archimedes had turned mathematics into a weapon, and the balance of power shifted. Marcellus himself is said to have marveled at the machines. He had heard tales of Archimedes' brilliance, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. The general grew wary, ordering his men to keep their distance, knowing that every approach might trigger another deadly device. For Archimedes, the machines were a grim necessity. He did not relish their destruction, but understood their importance. His city depended on him, and he gave it the best defense he could. In his hands, catapults became not only engines of war, but also demonstrations of geometry's power. Every trajectory, every impact was the unfolding of a proof in wood and stone. The siege dragged on. Rome, accustomed to swift victories, found itself humiliated by an elderly mathematician who seemed to command the very laws of nature. Syracuse held out, not through overwhelming armies, but through the mind of one man. Yet Archimedes was far from finished. Catapults alone were not enough. The Romans had powerful fleets, and if they could breach the harbor, Syracuse would be lost. Archimedes knew this, and so he devised something even stranger, something that would pass into legend, machines that could reach out from the city's walls and pluck ships from the sea. As Roman ships pressed toward the harbor of Syracuse, they faced not only a storm of missiles, but a weapon unlike anything they had ever seen. Suspended from the city walls were great cranes fitted with hooks and grappling arms, devices that would later be remembered as the claw of Archimedes. The principle was simple, but devastating. When an enemy ship drew too close, a hidden mechanism would swing out over the water. Iron claws or grappling hooks, lowered on chains, seized the prow of the vessel. With a system of pulleys and counterweights, the machine lifted the ship partly from the water, tilting it dangerously. Sometimes it dropped the vessel back with such force that the hull shattered. Other times it simply overturned the ship entirely, spilling soldiers into the sea. Imagine the terror of the Roman sailors. Accustomed to ramming their way into harbors, they suddenly found their ships jerked upward by invisible hands, lifted as though by a giant's grip, and dashed against the waves. Ancient accounts say panic spread through the fleet as men cried out that the gods of Syracuse themselves were defending the city. For the defenders on the walls, the spectacle must have been exhilarating. To see the mighty Roman navy humiliated by the contraptions of their resident mathematician inspired confidence. Each time a ship was toppled, cheers echoed through the streets. Archimedes had not only saved the city, but also given it a psychological edge. Rome's reputation for invincibility cracked before the eyes of its enemies. The claw was a perfect example of Archimedes' genius. He had taken the same principles of levers and pulleys that could move cargo or raise ships in harbor and repurposed them for war. It was not sorcery, but geometry that gave the illusion of divine power. Yet in the confusion of battle, few Romans cared about principles. They only knew that approaching Syracuse meant disaster. Still, Archimedes knew the city could not rely on terror forever. The Romans were persistent. They studied their enemies, adapted, and returned. For every machine he built, there would eventually be a counter. Yet in these early months of the siege, his inventions turned the tide. Syracuse endured, and the name of Archimedes spread through the camps of Rome and across the Mediterranean. But Archimedes' legend was not yet complete. Beyond his cranes and catapults, there were whispers of something even more incredible, that he could harness the very power of the sun to burn Roman ships where they floated. Whether true or myth, the story of the burning mirrors would become one of the most enduring tales of his genius. As the Roman fleet regrouped after the humiliations of catapults and claws, another story began to circulate, a tale so strange that it blurred the line between fact and legend. It was said that Archimedes could set ships aflame using only the rays of the sun. The account, repeated by later writers, tells of great polished bronze shields or mirrors arranged in ranks along the city walls. When enemy ships approached, Archimedes directed soldiers to angle the mirrors toward them. Sunlight, reflected and concentrated, struck the Roman sails and timbers. At first, nothing happened, only blinding glare. Then, under the relentless heat, smoke rose, sails blackened, and wood burst into flame. Panic spread among the fleet as vessels burned without a single torch or arrow cast against them. For the Romans, already unnerved by claws and catapults, such a sight would have seemed supernatural. They had long attributed lightning and storms to the will of the gods. Now it seemed as though Syracuse commanded Apollo's fire itself. Soldiers muttered that they were not fighting men, but spirits armed with divine power. But was it true? Historians and engineers have debated the tale for centuries. Some dismiss it as later embellishment, pointing out the practical difficulties, aligning enough mirrors, maintaining focus on moving ships, and sustaining enough heat to ignite timber in battle conditions. Others argue it may have been possible under ideal circumstances: clear skies, calm waters, stationary targets. Modern experiments, from the Renaissance to the present day, have produced mixed results. Whether or not Archimedes truly burned ships with sunlight, the power of the story cannot be denied. It became a symbol of his genius, a metaphor for his ability to turn ordinary principles into extraordinary weapons. Even if no Roman vessel ever caught fire under his mirrors, the idea that he could wield the sun itself was enough to sow fear. The legend also reflected how the people of Syracuse viewed him. To them, Archimedes was more than a mathematician. He was a kind of magician of geometry, a man whose machines blurred the line between human craft and divine intervention. The story of the burning mirrors fit perfectly into this image. And for Archimedes, whether he built such devices or not, the tale captured his spirit. He did not see the world as fixed or limited. He saw possibilities everywhere, in ropes and levers, in water and light. If the story is myth, it is a myth that reflects truth, that Archimedes' mind burned as brightly as the sun itself, dazzling friend and foe alike. In the end, what mattered was not whether the mirrors worked, but that the Romans believed they might. Fear itself was a weapon, and Archimedes had given Syracuse that advantage. Yet even the most brilliant inventions could not hold back Rome forever. The siege dragged on, and Rome's patience would prove as dangerous as its armies. The siege of Syracuse quickly turned into a test of wills, not merely between Rome and the city, but between Rome and one man, Archimedes. Every advance the Romans attempted seemed to meet with disaster. Their siege towers were smashed by stones hurled from catapults. Their ships were lifted and capsized by cranes. Even their morale suffered as rumors spread that Archimedes could summon fire from the heavens. Marcellus, the Roman general, found himself in a humiliating position. Rome was accustomed to victory. Its armies feared across the Mediterranean. Yet here, at Syracuse, a single elderly mathematician was holding them at bay. The soldiers began to dread the very sight of the city walls. As they advanced, they expected not only arrows and stones, but contraptions of unimaginable design. Claws, mirrors, secret traps waiting to be unleashed. Ancient writers tell us that Archimedes even designed short-range defenses, small catapults and mechanisms hidden behind the walls, ready to strike down soldiers who came too close. Romans approaching with ladders or rams were suddenly met with showers of darts or heavy beams dropped from above. The ingenuity seemed endless, as if the walls themselves were alive with his genius. The frustration grew so intense that Marcellus is said to have remarked bitterly, "We are fighting against the geometry of Archimedes." His words captured the strange truth. The Romans were not only facing stone and timber, but also the invisible laws of mathematics, wielded by a man who understood them better than anyone alive. Despite their setbacks, the Romans did not retreat. Rome was patient, and its strength lay not only in force, but in persistence. The siege dragged on through months and then years, wearing down Syracuse. Though Archimedes' machines inflicted heavy losses, they could not conjure food, nor prevent exhaustion from sapping the city's strength. Inside Syracuse, the mood swung between triumph and anxiety. Citizens cheered as Roman ships were overturned, yet they knew the enemy outside the walls was relentless. Archimedes himself, though dedicated to his work, must have sensed the inevitable. Machines could delay, but they could not change the tide of history. Rome would not abandon its prize. Still, in those years, Syracuse stood defiant. Archimedes had bought the city precious time, proving that knowledge could rival armies. For a brief moment, one man's mind held back the mightiest empire in the world. It was a triumph not only for Syracuse, but for the power of intellect itself. Yet triumph could not last forever. Rome learned, adapted, and waited. And in time, Syracuse would falter, not because of Archimedes' failure, but because no city, however ingenious, could stand alone against the weight of empire. For 2 years, Archimedes' machines had kept the Romans at bay. Catapults crushed their engines, cranes terrified their sailors, and hidden defenses bloodied their assaults. Syracuse seemed untouchable, a fortress not of stone alone, but of intellect. Yet no invention, however clever, could guard against the oldest weapon of war, time. By 213 B.C., the siege had dragged on, draining the city. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, and the once proud citizens grew weary of the endless struggle. Rome, on the other hand, remained patient. Marcellus and his legions tightened their blockade, cutting off Syracuse from aid. Slowly, the city began to starve. Inside the walls, politics fractured. Syracuse had long been divided between pro-Roman and pro-Carthaginian factions. With the young king Hieronymus dead, power lay in the hands of rival generals and councils, each pulling in different directions. Some urged continued defiance, trusting in Archimedes' genius. Others feared Rome's vengeance and argued for surrender. Discord gnawed at the unity, however strained, that had sustained the city. Marcellus, ever the strategist, waited for weakness. He knew that no wall, no machine could resist forever. And then opportunity came, not through battle, but through ritual. In 212 BC, the Syracusans celebrated a major festival honoring the goddess Artemis. The city, weary from years of siege, gave itself over to music, feasting, and drink. Guards relaxed, soldiers slept, and the vigilance that had once been unshakable faltered. Under cover of night, Roman troops launched a stealth assault. Scaling the walls in silence, they slipped past the defenses that had so long held them back. Without Archimedes' machines manned and ready, the walls offered little resistance. By dawn, Roman forces were inside the city. The great defenses of Syracuse, so feared in daylight, had been bypassed in darkness. Chaos erupted. Citizens awoke to the sound of Roman horns, soldiers pouring into the streets, houses set aflame. Archimedes' war engines stood silent, their ropes and beams useless without crews to man them. The ingenuity that had defended Syracuse for years was undone in a single night by human error and exhaustion. Marcellus himself was torn between pride and regret. He had admired Archimedes from afar, marveling at how one man had humbled the power of Rome. Now, as his soldiers flooded the streets, he knew Syracuse would fall, not to brilliance or courage, but to the inevitability of empire. The city that had once stood as a beacon of Greek ingenuity was overrun. Temples were looted, citizens slaughtered or enslaved, and the treasures of Syracuse carried away as spoils. In the chaos, one old man continued to draw circles in the sand, oblivious to the storm about to consume him. The dawn that followed Rome's night assault brought ruin to Syracuse. The city that had defied the legions for years now lay open, its defenses breached, its streets filled with the thunder of Roman boots. Soldiers stormed through the markets and temples, cutting down defenders, seizing treasures, and setting fire to homes. The proud jewel of Sicily, once a beacon of wealth and learning, dissolved into chaos. Syracusans who had once stood proudly atop the walls, cheering as Archimedes' machines repelled their enemies, now fled in terror. Families huddled in temples, seeking sanctuary. Merchants tried desperately to hide their gold, and soldiers threw down arms in despair. The long siege had broken not only the walls, but the spirit of the city. And yet, amid the chaos, one figure remained apart from the frenzy. Archimedes, now in his 70s, sat quietly in his home, absorbed not in battle, but in geometry. According to later accounts, he was bent over a tablet, drawing figures in the sand, when Roman soldiers burst through his doors. Marcellus had given strict orders. Archimedes was not to be harmed. He valued the old man's genius, hoping to bring him alive to Rome. But war has little patience for nuance. One version of the story says a soldier commanded Archimedes to follow him immediately. The mathematician, refusing to leave his work unfinished, begged for a moment to complete his proof. The soldier, angered or impatient, drew his sword and struck him down. Another account claims Archimedes was killed while carrying mathematical instruments mistaken for gold or weapons. Yet another suggests he was slain despite crying out that he was Archimedes, the very man the general sought to spare. However it happened, the result was the same. The greatest mind of the age was cut down by an ordinary soldier. His life ended not by logic or invention, but by the chaos of war. When Marcellus learned of the death, he was said to be grief-stricken. He had admired Archimedes, even feared him, and had hoped to save him. Instead, Rome's triumph was stained by tragedy. A city was conquered, its treasures plundered, but its greatest treasure, the living mind of Archimedes, was lost forever. In the years following Syracuse's fall, tales of Archimedes' machines spread far beyond Sicily. Roman soldiers who had survived the siege carried home stories of monstrous claws that lifted ships from the water, of stones hurled with such force they shattered siege towers, and of sunlight itself turned into fire. These accounts mixed fact with awe, transforming Archimedes from an engineer into a figure of near mythical power. To the Romans, recounting these stories was both humiliating and fascinating. They had conquered Syracuse in the end, but not before being made to look vulnerable by one old man. The very name of Archimedes evoked both fear and respect. Marcellus himself, though victorious, is said to have remarked with regret that it was easier to subdue Syracuse without Archimedes than with him alive at its defense. For the Greeks, the stories became a source of pride. Even though Syracuse was lost, Archimedes' genius was undeniable. He had shown that intellect could hold back an empire, that for a time the pen, or rather the compass, was mightier than the sword. His devices became examples in philosophical texts, reminders of the power of reason over brute force. The catapults entered legend as weapons of unparalleled accuracy, the first truly scientific artillery. The claw inspired countless retellings, described as though a giant hand reached down from the heavens to punish invaders. The burning mirrors, whether fact or embellishment, became the most enduring image of all, Archimedes as the man who could harness the sun itself. Beyond legend, his principles remained practical. Roman engineers, though unable to replicate every device, studied what they could. Pulleys and cranes became standard tools of construction and war. Siege engines across the empire bore echoes of his designs. Even in defeat, Archimedes had reshaped the very mechanics of Roman power. Yet perhaps most striking was the contrast between Archimedes' own view of his work and how the world remembered it. To him, the machines were a distraction, necessary but crude compared to the elegance of his geometry. He had once written that his true pride lay not in the engines of war, but in the theorems of spheres and cylinders. And yet history, shaped by soldiers and storytellers, remembered the terror of his machines as vividly as the beauty of his proofs. The siege of Syracuse thus became a turning point in how Archimedes was remembered. No longer was he merely a mathematician lost in thought. He was the reluctant warrior, the scientist forced into battle, the man whose mind became a city's strongest wall. His inventions became legends, not because they lasted, but because they captured the imagination of all who heard of them. When news of Archimedes' death reached Marcellus, the Roman general was overcome with sorrow. He had admired the old man from afar, both fearing and respecting his genius. He had even ordered his soldiers to spare him, hoping to bring Archimedes alive to Rome as a living prize, perhaps even to employ his mind in the service of the Republic. Instead, the sword of a common soldier had silenced him forever. For Marcellus, the loss was more than personal disappointment. It was a blow to Rome itself. The city had conquered Syracuse and seized its treasures, but the greatest treasure, the intellect of Archimedes, had been destroyed in an instant. He ordered Archimedes buried with honor, ensuring that the man who had defied Rome would at least be remembered with respect. Meanwhile, Syracuse was transformed. The once proud Greek city became another possession of Rome, its autonomy erased, its wealth siphoned into the empire. Temples were looted, statues carried off to decorate Roman forums, and the bustling marketplaces fell silent under occupation. For the citizens, it was the end of an era. They had lost not only their independence, but the man who embodied their ingenuity and pride. In the years that followed, stories of Archimedes' final moments circulated widely. Some said he was killed while refusing to leave his diagrams, insisting he must complete his proof before following the soldier. Others claimed he carried mathematical instruments mistaken for gold. Still others believed he was slain despite declaring his name unrecognized in the chaos of conquest. However the details varied, the theme remained the same. Archimedes died as he lived, immersed in thought, devoted to geometry, even as war consumed the world around him. For the Greeks, his death became a tragedy of philosophy crushed by force. Archimedes represented the highest achievements of the mind, cut down by the lowest instincts of violence. For the Romans, it was a reminder that conquest, however glorious, could also destroy what was most precious. Marcellus himself later lamented that Syracuse had been easier to capture without Archimedes than with him alive to defend it. Archimedes' passing marked the end of an age. The Hellenistic world had produced many brilliant thinkers, but none who so perfectly united theory and practice. With his death, a bridge between abstract mathematics and real-world application was broken. Though his writings survived in part, his living presence, his restless imagination, his playful curiosity, his ability to turn geometry into machines was gone. Yet death did not erase his legacy. The principles he uncovered, the devices he built, and the stories that grew around him ensured that Archimedes' name would echo long after Syracuse was reduced to ruins. His city was conquered, but his mind would prove unconquerable. Archimedes wrote extensively, producing treatises on geometry, mechanics, hydrostatics, astronomy, and number theory. These works were not casual notes, but carefully structured arguments, written in the rigorous style of Greek mathematics. His proofs built from axioms step by step, leading the reader with clarity and inevitability toward truth. To hold one of his scrolls was to glimpse the workings of a mind centuries ahead of its time. Yet the survival of these works was precarious. After Syracuse's fall, many scrolls were carried off to Rome, where scholars began to study them. Cicero, writing a century later, described seeing Archimedes' tomb in Syracuse and lamented how little his own generation valued the mathematician compared to his contemporaries. Still, fragments of Archimedes' ideas made their way into Roman libraries and, eventually, into the hands of later thinkers. During the Middle Ages, much of the Greek intellectual heritage was preserved not in Europe, but in the Islamic world. Scholars in Baghdad, Alexandria, and Cordoba translated Archimedes' works into Arabic, studying his principles of mechanics, optics, and mathematics. They revered him not merely as an engineer, but as a philosopher of science. In these translations, Archimedes' voice survived the centuries when Europe itself seemed to forget him. When the Renaissance dawned, Greek manuscripts began to return to the West. Archimedes was rediscovered with awe. Humanists and mathematicians marveled at his insights, realizing that he had anticipated much of what they themselves were only beginning to uncover. Leonardo da Vinci sketched machines that bore echoes of Archimedes. Galileo praised him as a master, declaring that he was unmatched in combining experiment with theory. Newton, centuries later, studied Archimedes' method of exhaustion and recognized in it the seeds of calculus. Yet even in modern times, much of Archimedes' work remained hidden. Some texts were lost. Others survived only in fragments. One of the most extraordinary stories is that of the Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval prayer book written on recycled parchment. Beneath the Christian prayers, faint traces of Archimedes' original texts lay concealed, scraped away, but not destroyed. In the 20th century, scholars using new imaging techniques uncovered works long thought lost, including The Method, where Archimedes revealed his approach to using mechanical reasoning as a path to mathematical proof. These rediscoveries proved that Archimedes had gone even further than once imagined. He had not only solved problems, but had explored ways of thinking that foreshadowed modern science. Each recovered text deepened our sense of how extraordinary his mind had been. Thus, though soldiers took his life, they could not extinguish his ideas. Through translations, fragments, and rediscoveries, Archimedes' words continued to flow across centuries, shaping the foundations of mathematics, physics, and engineering. His work survived like echoes from a lost age, reminding each new generation that true genius cannot be conquered. When Europe emerged from the long shadows of the Middle Ages, it rediscovered the voices of antiquity. Among them, none shone brighter than Archimedes. His works, recovered and translated from Greek and Arabic sources, struck Renaissance scholars like revelations from another world, the words of a man who had walked centuries before them, yet thought as though he belonged to their own age. For the artists, architects, and engineers of the Renaissance, Archimedes was both inspiration and proof. Here was evidence that the ancients had not only dreamed, but also calculated, not only imagined, but also built. Leonardo da Vinci, fascinated by machines, studied the principles of levers and pulleys, sketching designs that echoed Archimedes' war engines. In his notebooks, Leonardo blended art and mechanics in a way that felt like homage to the Syracusan genius. Mathematicians and natural philosophers were even more direct in their admiration. Galileo Galilei, often called the father of modern science, revered Archimedes above all others. He saw in Archimedes a model of how to unite mathematics with physical observation. Galileo's studies of motion, buoyancy, and mechanics drew heavily on Archimedean principles. He once remarked that without Archimedes, his own work would have been impossible. The influence extended further. Johannes Kepler marveled at Archimedes' geometric methods, using them as inspiration for his own work on planetary motion. And when Isaac Newton developed calculus, he recognized that Archimedes' method of exhaustion had anticipated many of his own results. Newton humbly acknowledged, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Among those giants, Archimedes loomed tallest. The Renaissance also revived the mythic image of Archimedes. Artists painted him with compasses in hand, surrounded by diagrams, or standing on the walls of Syracuse as Roman ships burned in the harbor. To the humanists, he embodied the ideal of the universal man, philosopher, mathematician, inventor, and dreamer. The printing press amplified his legacy. For the first time, Archimedes' works were widely circulated, no longer confined to rare manuscripts in monasteries or libraries. Scholars across Europe debated his theorems, applied his principles, and built upon his insights. His ideas were no longer the guarded treasures of a few, but the foundation stones of a new scientific age. In this way, Archimedes became more than a historical figure. He became a patron saint of discovery, a symbol that intellect could defy time, empire, and even death. His survival through the centuries reassured Renaissance thinkers that their pursuit of knowledge was part of a grand tradition, stretching back to Syracuse and the quiet genius who once muttered proofs in the dust. The scientific revolution was not born from nothing. It stood upon ancient roots, and at those roots was Archimedes, the mathematician who had turned numbers into levers, proofs into machines, and curiosity into eternal truths. More than 2,000 years after his death, the name of Archimedes still resonates. His discoveries are taught in classrooms across the world. His machines, though primitive by modern standards, inspire awe for their ingenuity. His cry of "Eureka!" has become shorthand for the thrill of discovery, invoked whenever a mind, after long struggle, suddenly grasps the truth. In science and engineering, his principles remain alive. The Archimedean screw still lifts water in fields from India to Africa, a simple device as effective now as it was in ancient Syracuse. Pulleys and levers, refined by centuries, remain fundamental to cranes, lifts, and countless machines. The principle of buoyancy underpins modern naval engineering. Every ship, from fishing trawler to aircraft carrier, floats by rules first articulated in a Sicilian bathhouse. But Archimedes' legacy is not confined to mechanics. In mathematics, his methods foreshadowed calculus centuries before Newton and Leibniz. His explorations of infinity, his method of exhaustion, and his studies of curves remain landmarks in the history of thought. Modern mathematicians still marvel at his rigor, recognizing that with only sand, chalk, and imagination, he reached results that would not be matched until the dawn of modern science. Culturally, Archimedes endures as the archetype of the absent-minded genius. Tales of him forgetting meals, running naked through the streets, or dying because he refused to leave his diagrams, all paint a picture of a man consumed by thought. Whether exaggerated or true, these stories capture the essence of intellectual passion, the drive to pursue knowledge even when the world around demands otherwise. In monuments and memory, his mark remains. Cicero claimed to have rediscovered Archimedes' neglected tomb in Syracuse, adorned with the sphere and cylinder he so loved. Today, statues, engravings, and textbooks across the globe preserve his likeness, often with compass in hand, eyes fixed on eternal truths. Archimedes' story also serves as a cautionary tale. His death at the hands of a soldier reminds us of the fragility of knowledge in times of war. Ideas can survive, but only if they are cherished and preserved. Syracuse fell, its treasures scattered, but the spark of Archimedes' mind endured because others, across cultures and centuries, chose to carry it forward. Perhaps the greatest testament to his legacy is this, that we do not remember him merely as a citizen of Syracuse or a subject of Hiero, but as a mind belonging to humanity itself. He transcended the boundaries of time, place, and politics. He proved that intellect is a power as real as armies, and that discovery is a kind of immortality. When we lift with a lever, calculate with pi, or speak of a eureka moment, we are, in a small way, standing beside Archimedes. His life reminds us that curiosity, rigor, and imagination can outlast empires. Long after Rome fell, long after Syracuse was reduced to ruins, Archimedes' genius endures, as vital today as it was more than 2 millennia ago. With that, my friends, we have come to an end of this video. If this video has helped you into your slumber, sleep tight and have a sweet dream. If you were able to learn from this video, I will consider myself successful in teaching you about one of the greatest minds in history. If you want to help this channel out, you have done so by watching this far into the video. If you missed the first part of the video and want to learn the early life of Archimedes, you can do so by clicking the video on the screen. Thank you, and see you on the next video. And subscribe, because we'll have videos like these that might make you a tiny bit smarter every time you go to bed.